In the early 19th century, most people in the United States made their living as farmers. Over time, however, this changed dramatically. Collectively, this shift in the American economy is known as the Market Revolution, indicating the change from a time where most Americans raised their own food and manufactured most of their own goods, to one where they depended upon market activities. More and more Americans left the farm to engage in other occupations, particularly manufacturing and commerce, while even those who remained as farmers became more commercial in orientation, increasingly growing crops to sell in the marketplace rather than to simply feed their families. While this change affects all portions of the country, its primary impact was upon the North, as this map makes clear. As you can see, agriculture remained the overwhelmingly dominant economic activity in the South, but of declining importance in the North. It's also important to note that the majority of farmers in the South remained subsistence farmers. In other words, while the economy of the North was becoming increasingly capitalistic and market-oriented, the Southern economy remained relatively unchanged from what it had been in the 18th century. What were the key forces driving this economic transformation? The market revolution was created, in no small part, by the rapid expansion and improvement of transportation systems throughout the country. Prior to the 19th century, the ability to trade goods over long distances was severely limited. While it was possible to move large cargoes on boats and ships, regions that didn't have access to the ocean or navigable rivers were relatively isolated. Moving goods by wagons over dirt roads was expensive and slow. Before 1815, for instance, it cost as much to ship freight over 30 miles of domestic roads as it did to send the same weight of cargo across the Atlantic. This era witnessed a considerable amount of basic road building. By 1821, for instance, there were some 4,000 miles of toll roads funded by private corporations and local governments. We also see the development of the National Road, which was a federal project designed to link the states in the Northwest with the Atlantic coast. By 1818, it had reached Ohio, and by 1838, Illinois. This is the only major road project funded directly by the federal government prior to the Civil War. Many states objected to the idea of the central government spending money out of the general fund, into which all states contributed, to build roads that primarily served only a few states. In the case of the National Road, this problem was avoided by paying for it out of profits from land sales in the Northwest, the same region that enjoyed the benefits of this improvement. Ultimately, roads still suffered from some serious problems. Wagons could only go as fast as a horse could walk, about 4 miles per hour, and they could only carry relatively small cargoes. Roads were often also closed by nature, particularly in the north. Winter blocked roads with snow, while spring contributed rain and mud. Natural waterways, such as rivers, lakes, and the ocean, were still the key arteries of commerce. What changed was how these waterways were traveled. Rivers were of vital importance, particularly the Mississippi that tied the northwestern states to the world through the port of New Orleans. Moving downstream was relatively easy. Goods were piled on crude flatboats and then floated down the river using its own currents. Coming back upstream, however, was quite a different challenge. Keelboats, which were manually pulled by the crew or towed by horses, proved slow and inefficient. On average, it cost about $100 a ton to move freight upriver. In 1807, however, Robert Fulton demonstrated one of the first practical steamboats, and by the early 1830s, the technology had become widespread. Steamboats could move much faster, both up and downstream, and they could carry much larger cargoes. An equally important development was the creation of a system of canals, artificial waterways that linked natural waterways. Moving barges through the canals provided significant advantages over using horse-drawn wagons. Barges were typically towed by horses, so they didn't move significantly faster than wagons, still about 4 miles per hour. But since they were moving on a frictionless surface, water, the horses could pull much larger loads. One of the first and most important projects was the Erie Canal, which connected Lake Erie with the Atlantic, running a distance of 350 miles. It was extremely expensive, costing $8.5 million to build, but it was also hugely successful. Within the first 7 years, the canal had been paid for out of the tolls charged to traffic. At the same time, the cost of shipping freight dropped dramatically. Other states quickly copied New York, and with the aid of foreign capital, they began feverishly building their own canals. Unfortunately, they were very, very expensive to build, and few proved as profitable as the Erie Canal. Many states ended up deeply in debt. Kentucky even declared bankruptcy. There were other problems with canals. For instance, they needed to be regularly dredged, otherwise they would simply fill up with silt and become useless. Seasonal droughts sometimes lowered the water level to the point that they were unpassable, and those shallow channels were subject to freezing over in the winter months. The final element in the transportation revolution in the early 19th century was the development of the railroad system. They were significantly cheaper to build than canals. They could operate in all seasons, and they were much, much faster. Because of these factors, the railroad system developed rapidly after 1830. By 1850, there were about 8,500 miles of rail, and by 1860, over 27,000 miles. What was the impact of this transportation revolution? Well, it established the basis for a flourishing commercial and industrial economy in the North. You'll note that most of these transportation improvements are taking place in the North, and that they primarily link the Northeast with the Northwest. As the Northeast became urbanized and industrialized, farmers in the Northwest increasingly produced commercial crops that were sent east to feed the hungry urban masses. Other industries that provide basic raw materials for industry similarly sprang up in the West. The reverse was also true. As the urbanizing Northeast became an important market for the Northwest became a key market for the manufactured goods of the East, as commercial farmers and others engaged in a market economy now had the cash to buy these goods.